Every few years, someone tells you Dale Carnegie is dated, folksy, a relic. A book for 1930s door-to-door salesmen with slicked-back hair and a briefcase full of encyclopedias. They're wrong. And the dismissal itself reveals how little most people actually understood the book. Today I'm going to show you why a book written in 1936 beat modern behavioral psychology to half its conclusions by decades, and the 2 specific things you can do differently tomorrow morning because of it. I'm Jake, and this is the Operator's Library, where we go deep on the books that change how operators actually think and build. Today, How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie, first published in 1936. Over 30 million copies sold. Still the most underrated book on human behavior most of you will ever read. Here's what we're covering. I'm going to Steelman the dismissal, give it every possible credit, and then show you exactly why it falls apart. Then we're going deep on 3 principles most people either skip past or misread entirely. And we'll close with 2 concrete things you actually do differently starting tomorrow. Let's get into it. So, let's take the dismissal seriously for a second because it's not stupid. The book does feel dated in places. Carnegie writes in this warm, almost folksy tone. His examples are insurance salesmen and factory foremen and dinner party guests in 1930s New York. He says things like, smile more and remember people's names, and on the surface that sounds like advice your grandmother gives you before a job interview. And the critics have a point. A lot of what gets sold as Carnegie-inspired in the self-help industrial complex is shallow. Manipulative even, the smile and handshake surface layer, stripped of everything underneath it. But here's where the dismissal breaks down. Carnegie wasn't writing tips. He was writing a theory of human motivation, and that theory holds up not because it sounds nice, but because the underlying science validated it decades later. Robert Cialdini published Influence in 1984. 48 years after Carnegie. And when you read both books back to back, you start to notice something uncomfortable. Cialdini's liking principle, the idea that people say yes to people they like, and they like people who make them feel seen, is almost a word-for-word restatement of what Carnegie had already mapped in 1936. Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow gave us System 1 and System 2 thinking. The idea that most human decisions are emotional first, rational second. Carnegie had no access to that framework. But his entire book is built on that exact insight. Every technique in that book is designed to work with System 1, to make the emotional brain feel safe, respected, and important before you ever try to engage the logical brain. He didn't have the vocabulary, but he had the map. That's the real case for Carnegie, not nostalgia, not tradition. The fact that a man with no formal psychology training writing in 1936 reverse-engineered human behavior so accurately that the scientific establishment spent the next 70 years catching up to him. Now, let's talk about what the book actually says. Not all 30 principles. That's what summary channels are for. I want to go deep on 3. The ones that are most misunderstood, most underrated, and most immediately useful. The first one, talk in terms of the other person's interests. This sounds obvious. It almost sounds too simple to be worth saying, and that's exactly why most people blow past it and don't actually do it. Here's what Carnegie actually meant. He wasn't saying, find common ground. He wasn't saying, be relatable. He was saying something more specific and more powerful. Before you enter any conversation where you want something, a deal, a decision, a behavior change, you need to understand what the other person is already trying to accomplish and frame your ask inside that frame. Not your frame, their frame. He tells his story about a man named Frank Betger, a salesman who was struggling until he started asking one question at the start of every sales call. What is it you're most concerned about right now? Not, let me tell you about my product, not, here's why we're the best option. Just, what are you trying to solve? That question changes everything. Because once you know what someone actually cares about, you stop selling and start helping. And people will do almost anything for someone they feel is genuinely helping them. Modern strategists call this leading with their problem. Marketers call it entering the conversation already happening in the prospect's head. Negotiators call it anchoring to their interests, not your position. Carnegie called it talking in terms of the other person's interests in 1936. But here's where it gets interesting, and where most people get it wrong. This principle is not a technique. It's not something you do in the first 2 minutes of a meeting and then drop. It's a posture. It's a way of preparing for every significant conversation you have. The operators who actually use this well, the founders who close deals they shouldn't be able to close, the managers who get buy-in from people who were skeptical, they're not doing it in the room. They're doing it before the room. They're asking, what does this person care about? What are they measured on? What keeps them up at night? What would make this conversation feel like a win for them regardless of what I need? That preparation is the actual skill. The conversation is just the output. The second principle, make the other person feel important and do it sincerely. Pay attention to that last part, sincerely. Because this is where Carnegie separates himself from the manipulation playbook, and it's where most readers miss the point entirely. Carnegie is not telling you to flatter people. He's not telling you to perform interest you don't feel. He's telling you something harder and more valuable that every person you will ever deal with, every employee, every client, every investor, every difficult counterpart has a deep, nearly universal need to feel that they matter, that their work matters, that their perspective matters, that they are not invisible. And most of us, most of the time, are terrible at meeting that need. Not because we're malicious, because we're busy, because we're in our own heads, because we're thinking about our next point while someone else is still finishing their sentence. Carnegie's prescription is simple. Stop. Actually pay attention. Find the thing that is genuinely admirable or interesting about this person and tell them, not generically, specifically. There's a difference between great job on that presentation and the way you handled that third question, where you paused and reframed the whole thing. That was the moment the room shifted. I noticed that. The second one lands differently because it's specific, because it proves you were actually watching, because it makes the other person feel seen, not just approved of. Cialdini would later call this the unity principle, the idea that people are most influenced by people they feel genuinely connected to. Carnegie got there first, and he got there without a single neuroimaging study. Now here's the pressure test. Does this work on everyone? No. There are people, and Carnegie acknowledges this, who are so guarded, so transactional, or so adversarial that genuine warmth reads as weakness or manipulation. In those contexts, you need different tools. Carnegie's framework assumes a baseline of good faith. Where that good faith doesn't exist, these principles can leave you exposed. But in the vast majority of professional relationships with your team, your clients, your partners, your investors, the gap between how important people feel and how important they actually are is enormous. And closing that gap consistently is one of the highest leverage things a leader can do. The third principle. The only way to get the best of an argument is to avoid it. This is the one that aggressive operators hate, and it's the one they most need to hear. Carnegie's claim is blunt. You cannot win an argument. Even if you win, you lose. Because the moment someone feels defeated in an argument, they don't update their belief. They dig in. They walk away looking for reasons you were wrong. You've won the exchange and lost the relationship. Most high performers resist this because they've been rewarded their whole careers for being right. Being right is how they got here. Arguing their position is how they got results. So the idea of not arguing feels like surrender. But Carnegie isn't telling you to capitulate. He's telling you to pick a different game. The alternative he proposes is this. Instead of trying to prove someone wrong, ask questions that lead them to discover the problem with their own thinking. Let them talk. Let them reason out loud. And when you disagree, don't lead with the disagreement. Lead with what they got right, and then introduce the complication. This is what Kahneman would later call slow thinking, getting someone out of their reactive, defensive system 1 and into the deliberate, open system 2, where they can actually update their beliefs. Carnegie's version: I may be wrong, I frequently am. Let's examine the facts together. That phrase, I may be wrong, is one of the most disarming sentences in professional life. Because the moment you say it sincerely, the other person no longer needs to defend against you. The threat is gone. And when the threat is gone, they can actually think. I've watched founders blow up investor relationships because they couldn't resist winning a debate in a pitch meeting. I've watched managers lose their best people because they had to be right in a one-on-one. The argument was won, the relationship was over. Carnegie saw this pattern everywhere in 1936. It hasn't changed. Here's where I'll push back on the book, because it deserves it. Carnegie's framework has a serious assumption baked in, that everyone you're dealing with is operating in good faith, that the employee who pushes back, the client who hesitates, the counterpart who stalls, they're all reasonable people with reasonable concerns that can be addressed through empathy and reframing. Sometimes that's true. Often it's true, but not always. And Carnegie doesn't give you much to work with when it isn't. The techniques in this book, applied without the underlying ethic, become manipulation. And Carnegie knew that. He was explicit about the word sincerely for a reason. But modern readers often pick up the techniques and leave the ethic behind. That's how you get people who do Carnegie in a way that feels slippery and hollow. The book is not a manipulation manual, it's a framework for building real relationships through genuine attention and respect. Used that way, it's extraordinary. Stripped of that foundation, it's a con. Read it the right way. If you've stayed with me this long, here's what I want you to actually do tomorrow morning. Not go build better relationships. Specific, small, doable. First, before your next significant meeting, a one-to-one, a client call, a pitch, a difficult conversation, spend 5 minutes writing down what the other person is actually trying to accomplish right now. Not what you need from them, what they need, period. What would make this conversation feel like a win for them? Then open the meeting by asking about that. Let them talk first. Carnegie called this talking in terms of the other person's interests. You'll feel the energy in the room shift almost immediately. Second, find one person on your team this week, someone who's been doing solid work quietly without a lot of recognition, and give them one specific, genuine piece of acknowledgement. Not great job. Tell them the specific thing you noticed, the specific moment. Make them feel seen. That's it. One person, one specific observation. Carnegie spent a whole chapter on this because it costs nothing, and most leaders almost never do it. Those two things. Tomorrow. That's the whole application. Here's the real takeaway from 89 years of how to win friends and influence people. The book is not about being nice. It's not about being likable. It's about understanding that human beings are emotional creatures who make decisions based on how they feel, and that the most effective operators in any room are the ones who understand that and work with it instead of against it. Carnegie figured that out in 1936. The behavioral scientists confirmed it in the 1980s and 90s, and most leaders are still ignoring it in 2025. If this breakdown was useful, subscribe. I put out a new deep dive every week on the books that actually change how operators think and build. And I want to know, what's your honest take on Carnegie? Is this a book you've actually used or gotten value from? Or does it feel too soft for the environments you're operating in? Drop it in the comments. I read every one, and that question will probably shape what I cover next. Next week, we're going into Robert Cialdini's influence. And now that you've seen how much of Carnegie's framework Cialdini validated, that video is going to hit differently. See you then.